I know I get criticized. I'm told I get criticized by the New Left. I have the most progressive record of anybody running for the United, if anybody who would run. I didn't mean. With anybody who would run.
We must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post.
Hi, Kevin. This is Gabrielle Kelly of The Washington Post. How are you?
Hey there, it's Simon from The Post.
Hey, it's Dave Farron from The Post. Have you got a second to talk?
This is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Thursday, March 7th. Today, revisiting Joe Biden's views on race, exploring Facebook's new promises on privacy, and a rebrand for veganism.
So here's what he had to say about busing. This is the real problem with busing. You take people who aren't racist, people who are good citizens, who believe in equal education and opportunity, and you stunt their children's intellectual growth by busing them to an inferior school, and you're going to fill them with hatred.
Matt Visor covers politics for The Post. And while he was doing some research on the presidential candidates and the potential presidential candidates, he got a tip from a Democratic source. It was a tip about an interview that then-Senator Joe Biden had done years ago. And this Democratic source said that they were concerned that Biden's positions were problematic.
So at the time, he was kind of talking about the government should not have a large role in integrating schools.
This interview with Biden took place back in 1975, 3 years after he was elected to the U.S. Senate at age 29 to represent his home state of Delaware. Matt spoke with my colleague, Gabrielle Kelly, about Biden's interview. How did you come across this Biden story?
So this interview was inserted into the congressional record at the time by a colleague of Joe Biden's, Frank Church, who was a fellow Democrat, who inserted this two-part interview that Biden did with a local weekly newspaper in Newark, Delaware. And it's a two-part interview, and most of it is an update on sort of what he's thinking. He's 2 years into office. He's a new senator. He's the youngest senator in the United States Senate. And the last portion of the interview was the part that jumped out to me, where he's talking a lot about racial issues at the time that were hot button then. And the language that he uses is quite striking for where we are now.
So what did he say in it?
Part of this is him defending or speaking out against busing, which at this time, the country was dealing with segregation, how to desegregate schools. And so busing was a major issue, particularly in cities. In this interview, Biden also argues that the government and society and the courts had gone too far since Brown versus Board of Education, which, this is 1975, just years really after the Civil Rights Act. So he's suggesting that society is doing too much to try to integrate schools. And here's one of the things that he said. We've lost our bearings since the 1954 Brown versus School Board desegregation case. To desegregate is different than to integrate. I got into trouble with Democratic liberals in 1972 when I refused to support a quota system for the Democratic National Convention. I am philosophically opposed to quota systems. They ensure mediocrity. The new integration plans being offered are really just quota systems to assure a certain number of blacks, Chicanos, or whatever in each school. That, to me, is the most racist concept you can come up with. What it says is, In order for your child with curly black hair, brown eyes, and dark skin to be able to learn anything, he needs to sit next to my blonde-haired, blue-eyed son. That's racist. Who the hell do we think we are that the only way a black man or woman can learn is if they rub shoulders with my white child?
The topic of reparations has come up recently and is certainly going to be an issue in this current election cycle. Joe Biden has talked about this in the past. What did he say about that, and how is that going to be reconciled with the current election?
It is dramatic. Kamala Harris has spoken out on this, Elizabeth Warren. The party is openly having a discussion over reparations. Joe Biden has said something about this back in 1975, and let me just read you what he said. I do not buy the concept popular in the 60s, which said we have suppressed the black man for 300 years, and the white man is now far ahead in the race for everything our society offers. In order to even the score, we must now give the black man a head start or even hold the white man back to even the race. I don't buy that. I don't feel responsible for the sins of my father and grandfather. I feel responsible for what the situation is today, for the sins of my own generation. And I'll be damned if I feel responsible to pay for what happened 300 years ago.
Needless to say, this isn't a good look for Democrats, particularly for Biden, as he thinks about announcing a potential candidacy for 2020. What does this mean for him?
He is entering a presidential campaign that is the most diverse field in history. You have two prominent black senators who are running and are very strong candidates. You have a party that is energized in part in opposition to rhetoric that President Trump often says. And so I think Joe Biden will have to respond to some of that and to account for how his views have potentially shifted, how he may have shifted with the time. But I think that's also a challenge because it's a reminder, I think, here where you're hearing a candidate from 44 years ago. And no other candidate in the field has that issue. Joe Biden was articulating something that not as controversial at the time as it is now. And his views may have shifted as the party's views have shifted on things, but he's emblematic of having to answer for, to use his phrase, the sins of, the past.
Some people may say that this happened such a long time ago. He's changed his views on things. But there have been some incidents recently where some might have said that he said things that have a racist framing, as recently as the 2008 election cycle.
Yeah, I think charitably, Biden's supporters may say that these are just gaffes. It illustrates his plain spokenness. But I think critics would point that a lot of his statements have, at least at that time, were playing into racial stereotypes. In 2007, he called Barack Obama.
You got the first sort of mainstream African American who is articulate and bright and clean and a nice looking guy. That's a storybook, man.
And in 2006, the year before, he talked about
in Delaware, the largest growth in population is Indian Americans moving from India. You cannot go to a 7-Eleven or a Dunkin' Donuts unless you have a slight Indian accent.
So again, I think Biden, he has had this propensity to play into some of those racial stereotypes. Even if his record, I think, in talking to black supporters in the NAACP, he does have a record that I think some like, and that they feel like he's been on their side, but his rhetoric oftentimes has tripped him up in playing into some of those racial stereotypes.
What has the Biden camp said about all this?
So Joe Biden declined a request for an interview about this, but the spokesman, Bill Russo, released quite a lengthy statement defending Biden to a large degree and his record on matters of race. They point out that he fought to desegregate a movie theater in Delaware, and throughout his life has pushed policies aimed at rooting out racism. But what was interesting is that he's not backing down. They're not disputing any portions from this interview. They're saying that they needed to be taken in the full context in which they were said, but he still defends his positions that he had in the interview largely, and in fact still says that Biden believes he was right to oppose busing during that time period. They also released a statement from Ralph Nees, the former executive director of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, defending Biden largely as a leader in the field of civil rights. We should say that there's been a lot of discussion and debate around busing. and whether it was the right decision or not. You know, there's not unanimity on this. Civil rights leaders sort of still point out that it was a necessary goal to try to further integrate the schools, and busing was something worth trying. Whether it achieved its ultimate aims is a matter of debate.
There were a lot of things in that interview that many people might perceive as being racist or racially insensitive. You know, did his people apologize?
No, in fact, quite the opposite. I mean, they sort of defend some of the things that he said and encouraged us to print the interview in full. It's interesting, his approach on this versus other issues. He has apologized and kind of walked back some of his feelings about the Anita Hill hearings, the criminal justice legislation in the 90s. So he has kind of changed and said that he's evolved on certain issues that are important to Black voters. This does not seem to be one of those, where at least so far he's not doing a lot to walk back these comments. They're explaining them further, but they're not apologizing or saying that he has changed over the intervening 4 decades.
This seems like it might be a little unusual that Biden is not commenting on this. Is this unusual to you?
Given that he has kind of spoken extensively on some of the other issues that could potentially cause him problems as he considers another presidential run, he's spoken extensively about those things. On this, you know, he sort of still firmly believes what he believed in 1975. He had these strong opinions and doesn't appear to have shifted away from those, which, you know, will be interesting to see how he handles if he runs a presidential campaign at a time when other Democrats are talking about reparations and, you know, some other sort of key issues that Biden, you know, hasn't necessarily shifted on.
Obviously, Joe Biden has not announced his candidacy for president. This is a wide open field, several diverse candidates. You know, how could these statements impact his potential candidacy for president?
One of his assets is that he's been around for a long time. But I think this also illustrates the downside of that, where he has been in public life for decades and has to respond to comments that he made decades ago when they were more in the mainstream, but certainly are not any longer. I think you have a new, energized, and younger electorate at this time. Joe Biden himself has been trying to figure out the social media lately and figuring out how to tap into social media and sort of the younger energy that exists in the Democratic Party right now. And I think many people are not familiar with busing and with the history of busing in this country and with Joe Biden's role and views on busing. So I think that those could have a hindrance on, at least in him appealing to this current Democratic electorate.
Matt Visor is a politics reporter for The Post. You can read a transcript of Biden's comments on race from that 1975 interview at postreports.com. This week, Facebook...
My son is Attorney General, a year in Iraq, came back, and that's one of the things that he finds was most in need. When he was over there in Iraq for a year, people would come to him and talk about what was happening at home in terms of foreclosures, in terms of bad loans that were these Shylocks who took advantage of these women and men while overseas.